RC Institute and GMI Ratings webinar on a new study. The election of corporate directors. What happens when shareholders withhold a majority of votes from director nominees? Our agenda today includes introduction, why this research was conducted, and an extensive review of the research. Our speakers today include John Lekumnick, Executive Director of the IRC Institute, and Kimberly Gladman, the research report's author, and she's also Director of Research and Risk Analytics with GMI Ratings. Also on the call today will be Michelle Lamb, Senior Research Associate with GMI Ratings, who worked closely with Kimberly on this study. Now I'll turn it over to John Lekumnick with the IRC Institute to discuss the Institute and why the research was commissioned. John?
Thank you, Kelly. Many of you on the call have been on previous IRC Institute calls, but I would like to just take a moment to identify us. We are a not-for-profit. What we do is try to provide objective, non-advocacy research about accountable capitalism, responsible capitalism, whatever you want to call it, but basically research at the intersection of corporate responsibility and the informational needs of investors. And that includes the capital market context in which investors and companies make decisions. Because we are a not-for-profit and an educational organization, all of our research that we commission and pay for is available free of charge at our website. Next slide, please. Some of that research that we've done recently is shown here. I am not going to go through it all, but what I think is interesting is it does hit the traditional ESG rubrics, as well as cutting across those rubrics and dealing with some of the capital market issues, such as how mutual funds decide to vote, or mergers and acquisitions theory, state of engagement between U.S. corporations and shareholders. So what we try to do is create this body of quality, objective research that various advocates or just investors or corporates can use moving forward. The reason we chose to fund this research is twofold. First, there's a little bit of the emperor's new clothes, that old fable about the emperor walking around naked and everyone being afraid to say it. Director elections are the fundamental accountability mechanism in our form of capitalism. That responsibility of directors to be elected and the responsibility of investors to take their vote for directors seriously is embedded in all of our legal framework. It underpins everything from the shareholder rights movement of the last 25 years to such fundamental things as the business judgment rule under Delaware law. And yet it is an open secret among the people that are probably on this call that most directors can be elected with one vote. There is largely a plurality voting system, and Kimberly and Michelle will get into that later. And moreover, even when directors fail to receive a majority of votes, they still serve. In the last 5 to 7 years, there has been an attempt by various groups to move the United States on a private ordering mechanism, that is, not regulatorily, but on a company-by-company basis to a majority voting standard, without disclosing all the results, which Kimberly and Michelle will in a moment. That actually does have some effect on when a director fails to achieve a majority vote, whether they in fact continue to serve. And so one of the things, the second reason, aside from the overall accountability emperor's new clothes issue that we wanted to look at, was, does failing to achieve a majority vote matter if you have a majority voting system, if you have a plurality voting system, and what are the implications when someone fails to achieve a majority vote? Many companies think there is no real implication mentioned it's sort of a tick-the-box voting by in response to a proxy advisory service. As we will see, that's not true. The issue with the movement to majority voting, however, is it has been successful, but it has been largely a large capitalization company phenomenon. So that you've got 4/5 of the S&P 500 adopting some type of majority voting standard, but only 15% of the S&P small cap. And as you will see, what sort of voting standard there is has material implications for what happens when shareholders in those rare instances of trying to withhold votes actually do withhold the majority vote. With that, let me turn this over to Michelle Lamb, one of the report's co-authors from GMI Ratings, and I'll be back later to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everyone. First, a bit about GMI Ratings. We're an independent provider of ESG and accounting research and ratings. We produce nearly 5,500 ESG governance risk ratings and 18,000 AGR accounting risk ratings. So, and before I get to our key findings, I'd like to first spell out a couple definitions to be clear on the terms used throughout our report. First, the three types of director election standards: plurality, plurality plus, resignation policy, and majority. So the term plurality is that standard adopted by companies where in uncontested director elections, a director can be elected by just a plurality of the votes. And for companies with a plurality plus resignation policy, which we call plurality plus often, similarly, directors are elected by a plurality of votes, but then if that does not constitute a majority of support, the individual must then submit a resignation for consideration by the board, and the board does not need to accept it. But with a majority election standard, a director only gets elected if they earn a majority of votes in favor. So, and lastly, we're using the term withhold votes throughout the study, and that we use it to refer to votes cast either withhold or against, the latter being a valid option only on proxy cards at majority standard companies. So, into our key findings. Here you see the key findings from the report, and some results echoed popular knowledge, as John said, but others are very striking. So first, we found that the majority withhold votes are more common at the smaller firms and at those with plurality election standards. And this follows intuitively with John's remarks that more smaller cap companies have plurality election standards. We also found that relatively few votes, only 5%, led to director removal. Again, a common understanding, although the percentages are higher at companies that do not have a plurality standard. One of our more remarkable findings was on the probable causes of the votes. We found that only about half of them could be attributed to violations of best practices in governance, with the rest relating to issues specific to the company in question. So this argues for companies not to just dismiss these withhold votes as simply a matter of shareholders checking the box and voting according to guidelines or proxy advisors' advice. Rather, in half of the cases, it was truly the shareholders speaking out about company-specific issues. And another fifth of the votes occurred at companies where shareholders were using multiple means to express their disapproval of the board. And in some cases, the withhold votes were actually leading indicators of some governance overhauls. So to describe our sample, our study looked at majority withhold votes at companies in the Russell 3000, and we pulled our data from snapshots taken in late June of each year, so just before the Russell reconstitution in 2010, 11, and 12. And each snapshot, therefore, included votes that occurred at annual meetings since the previous July, but only for companies that were still constituents of that index, as with the snapshot. So because some companies are removed from the index over the course of each year for various reasons, our sample may not contain every majority withhold vote that occurred at a Russell 3000 company, but in total, our sample had 175 majority withhold votes. And because some companies, of course, experience multiple withhold votes, the sample includes 98 companies. So as is well known, the incidence of majority withhold votes is quite low. They occur at less than 2% of companies in the sample, and 80% of the votes were at Russell 2000 companies. which represents, of course, 2/3 of the sample. So small cap companies are somewhat more likely than large caps to experience majority withholds. Also, we found 91% of the votes occurred at companies with plurality election standards. So here, the table on this slide shows the breakdown of the reasons we could identify for the majority withhold votes. There are 3 main things we find interesting about this. The first is that a relatively limited set of reasons account for most of the votes. As you see, about 76% of the votes can be attributed to one of the first 6 causes. The second point is also that only about half of the votes were attributable to violations of the best practices in governance, like the adoption of a poison pill without shareholder approval, or directors having failed attendance, or having related party transactions at the company, or directors serving on too many boards. The other half were a result of concerns specific to the company's situation. And the third interesting point here is that 18% of votes, almost a fifth, occurred at companies where shareholders were expressing that broad-based dissatisfaction with the way companies were being run. And they were doing this through multiple withhold votes for directors, also opposition to pay plans, and sometimes even proxy contests. So in these cases, the majority withhold votes were just one indicator of a company with serious problems. So on the next slide, here are a few examples of companies that we placed in that general shareholder dissatisfaction category. So the first, Advanced Analogic, saw withhold votes above 30% for all its directors in 2009 and 10, as well as a majority of votes withheld from its chair in 2010. And as a point of reference, the average level of withhold votes for directors in our whole sample was 5%. So these levels of 30% are very significant. Advanced Analogic then faced a proxy contest in 2011 and was acquired by Skyworks Solutions in 2012. And our second example here, Chesapeake, is a well-known story. There were 2 directors that received majority withhold votes in 2012 following the high-profile scandal involving the loans to the CEO. And the company then underwent extensive governance restructuring following its annual meeting. And it separated its chair and CEO roles, appointed 4 new independent directors representing major shareholders, and is now taking the necessary steps to declassify the board. And you see Barnes Group and Ferro Corp are 2 more cases where in these cases the story does not seem to be over yet. It seems, and in all the cases, it's clear that the majority withholds are part of a pattern of shareholder discontent, and in some, it seems to be leading indicators of governance changes. So then we looked at the director departures. Another well-known finding that we reaffirmed is that most directors who failed to receive majority support nevertheless continue to serve. So in total, only 5% of the directors in this sample stepped down shortly after the meeting. 7 others did not stand for re-election at the next annual meeting. The numbers are, however, slightly higher at the subset of companies with plurality plus resignation standards, where 8% stepped down, and they're much higher at majority companies, where 50% stepped down. But we should note there that there were only 4 directors in that category that received majority withholds at majority standard companies. So that percentage, the 50%, is based on a very small sample of 2 out of 4. So now I will turn it over to Kimberly Gladman to present the rest of our findings.
Thank you, Michelle. On this slide, you'll see that we also looked at companies' level of disclosure regarding their responses to majority withhold votes, and we found that it varies with their director election standard. While 87% of the companies in the sample provided no disclosure at all about how the board viewed the votes, all of the companies with either plurality plus resignation or majority election standards did do so. And we did find that a few plurality standard companies also provided disclosure. Well, on the next slide, we wanted to highlight a few interesting examples. Annaly is a fairly well-known case in which a company with a majority standard retained a director who had received a majority withhold vote due to attendance failures. The company said it felt those attendance failures were excusable, and it was able to keep the director without violating the letter of its election standard, because that standard says that any director who doesn't get a majority shall, quote, hold over and continue to manage the business and affairs of the corporation until his or her successor is elected, unless the director resigns, close quote.
Another example is Hospitality Properties Trust, which also had a majority standard when one of its directors failed to get majority support this year. That director did resign in accordance with the standard. However, the company stated it believed that the vote was due to the entire board's opposition to a shareholder proposal that had passed repeatedly with majority support, and was therefore not a result of any personal failing on that individual's part. As a result, the board immediately requested that the director, quote, accept appointment to the vacancy created by his resignation, close quote, and he promptly did so. Another interesting example comes from Iris International, which has a plurality plus resignation standard and where the whole board received majority withholds in 2011. The company explained that it attributed the votes to withhold recommendations by ISS that resulted from the board's adoption of a poison pill without shareholder approval. Because all the directors got majority withholds, the company bylaws allowed the entire board to consider and then to reject one another's resignations. However, we should note that in this case, the company did shortly thereafter terminate the poison pill that had led to those withhold votes. On the next slide, we have another example from Vital Images. This is a plurality standard company that provided interesting disclosure, quite detailed, about its deliberations regarding a majority withhold vote driven by concerns about director overcommitment. Although it had no obligation to do so, the company disclosed in an 8K that the director in question had offered to resign, but the company had decided to retain him because he was a full-time director, served only on boards headquartered in his home city, and had perfect attendance at all the companies concerned, demonstrating that he did have adequate time to devote to each. But it was rare to see disclosure of this kind from firms with a plurality voting standard. And we noted that even among companies with majority or plurality plus resignation standards, where all of them made some type of 8K disclosure, a third of them did not explain why they thought the votes had occurred. On the next slide, we looked at governance changes. Did companies make any responses, changes to their governance that we could see in response to the votes? And in most cases, there were not any changes. Only one of the companies, Iris International, which we spoke about, that received majority withholds due to poison pill adoption, terminated the poison pill. A handful of companies changed their director election standard, but the connection between that and the withhold votes is not entirely clear. Compensation does seem to be one area where companies were more responsive. In several cases where members of a compensation committee received majority withhold votes, the companies, including those listed here, tied their executive compensation more closely to long-term performance or to appropriate peer groups in the year following the votes. Next slide. We performed a study of the relationship between majority withhold votes and stock price performance relative to peers. We used a methodology that matched companies by industry and market cap and examined performance in the year preceding and the year following the votes. We are cautious about interpreting the results for several reasons. The study has a relatively short time frame, and it covers a period in which general market conditions were quite volatile. In addition, we could not obtain performance data for some companies in some periods. However, we did find that more companies for which we had data underperformed than outperformed their peer groups in the year following the majority withhold votes by about 5% at the median. If this is borne out by more thorough study, it could mean that majority withhold votes are a leading indicator of peer group underperformance. And finally, we have conclusions for companies, for investors, and for researchers. The takeaway message for companies, we believe, is that majority withhold votes should not be dismissed as mere check-the-box routine exercises, since only about half of them relate to what we would consider violations of best practices in governance. For investors, we think the main lesson here is a confirmation that it is truly worth advocating for a move away from plurality voting, since companies with other standards are more likely to remove unelected directors and to disclose their responses to the vote. And finally, we hope that future research studies will be able to explore more fully the possible relationships between majority withhold votes and stock price performance. That concludes our presentation of the findings. So now we would like to move into Q&A.
Thank you, Kimberly. Just a few remarks before we move to your questions. This presentation will be available on the IRRC website along with the replay by tomorrow. We'll send out an email so that you're aware of the posting. Also, you can download the full report as well as the press release on www.irrcinstitute.org. as well as on the GMI Ratings website, gmiratings.com. To take questions, you'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen, you've got a question box. You can just type in a question there, and I will read it aloud to John, Kimberly, and Michelle. Alternatively, if you would like to ask your question over the phone line, just type in the question box, please unmute my phone line, and I'll unmute your phone line, and you can have a conversation with John, Michelle, and Kimberly. With that, I will start off with our first question. This is all about majority withholds. Any thoughts on the significance of withholds at lower levels?
This is Kimberly. I will take that one. We actually cite in the paper some very interesting academic research by Fisher-Gramlich et al. From 2009, which I think our study in some ways is continuing and expanding on themes explored there. So that study looked at withhold votes that were higher than the median for the peer group. So as we said in our study, that one found something similar, that on average in U.S. companies, you get withhold votes of about 5%, the typical director. So anything above that is quite significant. And that study found that companies that had higher than median withhold votes, where at least one director did, for their peer group, if major changes happened at the company in the year following, such as major divestitures or a change in CEO, that the market responded very positively to those changes, and that as measured by the stock price, and responded more positively to those changes at those companies than to peers. So basically, that the withhold votes were a sign of market sentiment about the company, that something needed to change. And I think that we see something similar in the report here, that we see so frequently, about a fifth of the time, the majority withhold votes are just one part of a pattern where you see above median withhold votes going on for years sometimes at companies. So I think that one of my recommendations for companies would be to look at your voting pattern. Don't just suddenly have a trigger when it reaches a majority withhold, but look at your votes every time, after every single election, and look, are they higher than average, and what might be brewing that you might want to look at before it gets to that point. And some companies, we saw from those disclosures, a few are doing that.
Okay, our next question, how closely did withhold votes correlate with the recommendations of proxy advisors?
John, do you want to, I know you and I have had a bit of discussion with that. Would you want to speak to that?
I did not, the study itself did not look specific.
We didn't look at it in this case.
Let me just, we have done a number of reports about proxy advisors, both starting from the votes and also process analyses for institutional investors. In fact, that was one of the major recent studies that we did, which again is available. What I will say is, if you can sort of derive it from this data, that 50% roughly of the votes were for violation of, let us call it, standard practice, which generally institution of poison pill without shareholder approval will trigger a proxy advisory recommendation against. So even not looking at it clearly, the correlation will be way over half. And I would suspect much more than that. Having said that, I would caution against thinking that this is blind following of proxy advisors. As you'll see in a number of our reports, correlation doesn't equal causation. Both proxy advisors and institutional investors are sentient thinking organizations, and they can come to the same conclusion. It doesn't take a lot to come to the same conclusion that if you're not present at a number of board meetings, you can't be a good director because you can't participate. And so in some ways, yes, I'm not minimizing the importance of proxy advisory services, but in some ways they are every bit as much standard takers from the marketplace as much as standard makers in the marketplace.
Thank you. Our next question. In pure majority, a director can stay for a year per state holdover rules, but must be elected by majority in the following year to stay on the board. Is there any data on this occurring?
There is data, if you'll go back to the slide about how many directors left. GMI ratings looked almost as many directors did not stand for re-election as resigned immediately thereafter. Again, these are small numbers, but I think the message is that companies are starting to get the idea, particularly those with majority standards are starting to get the idea. Now, one can, again, much like the question about the proxy advisory firms, the question of which came first is an interesting one. Is it that the companies are more enlightened and therefore have majority standards and therefore are more likely to have directors not be reelected if they are, again, a majority withhold or a majority against vote? Or does the majority standard force them into that position? I don't think we know the answer to that. It may not in the end matter. But clearly, 9 directors resigned immediately after receiving majority withhold or majority against votes, and 7 did not stand, so you've almost doubled the total.
Thank you. Our next question, in disclosures following a majority withhold, did companies discuss any engagement with investors on the reasons for withhold?
No, no, I read every single disclosure. No. They, whenever they said there were, as I said, there were a number that said why they thought it happened, but typically they either simply stated this was the reason, or in one case in Iris International, they gave a detailed description of why they believed it was due to the poison pill adoption, namely that ISS had never recommended against any of their directors previously, that there was various evidence that made sense that this was the reason, but there was never any disclosure of we talked to key investors and this is what they told us.
Thank you. Our next question, this is a multiple part question. When a director failed to receive a majority vote and the company's board did not remove a director, was there a similar vote tally for the director in the following year? Also, did a company's disclosure for the board's rationale to not removing the director play a role in increasing a for vote in the following year? Need me to reread that at all, Kimberly or Michelle?
Yeah, I don't think that that we looked at that enough to really be able to answer that. Just we didn't look systematically at repeats in that way. Just off the top of my head, anecdotally, I know there were a few people who got majority withholds in repeated years. I think in a couple of cases because of related party transactions, because of legal relationships with the company, but there were very few, so we didn't do that. But even if we did, I don't know how much you would be able to conclude from that, because it would just be a handful of people. But it would be an interesting question to find out how persuasive do investors find these explanations to be, which I think is underlying that question. It's an excellent question, maybe with a longer time frame. You could get enough examples to start looking at that, what happens to the vote levels.
Terrific. Well, that concludes our presentation and concludes our questions as well. Again, I'll remind everyone that the full report and this PowerPoint presentation and a replay will be available tomorrow on the IRRC website. The report currently is available, as is the press release. If you have any questions following this presentation, let me just forward the PowerPoint up to our contact slide. Feel free to call John Lekumnick or Kimberly Gladman. Their contact information is posted here. It's also on the website. And if you have any follow-up questions, we'd be happy to take them. Thank you so much for your time and interest, and we hope you have a nice afternoon. Thank you.